My name is Riley Knox. I was erased from my father's will and humiliated by my sister mid-flight, like I was nothing more than a uniform for show. But when our plane began to drop from the sky and the captain slumped over the controls, something inside me clicked. I didn't ask for permission, I stood up, and as 300 lives hung in the balance at 40,000 feet, I showed everyone, including the family that discarded me, what it means to survive, to lead, and to never again be invisible. The hotel conference room smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, an uninspired venue for the end of a man like Colonel Douglas Knox. My boots echoed on the tile as I stepped in, military issue and scuffed at the toes. I wore my dress blues, not for ceremony, but for armour. I hadn't seen my sister in over 6 years, and I wasn't about to greet her in civilian clothes. Amelia Knox didn't flinch when I entered. She didn't turn her head, didn't rise from the head of the table, just shifted her eyes, sharp as glass, and let her gaze pass over me like I was an afterthought. "Riley," she said flatly, like she was checking off a roll call. "Didn't expect you'd make it back from... Where is it this time? Iraq, Germany." "Ramstein," I replied. "Right," she muttered, already turning away to whisper something to the family attorney. The man barely acknowledged me, his tie askew and laptop humming beside him. I took the empty seat furthest from Amelia. There was no warmth in this room, no grief, just cold air conditioning and the scent of ink from legal documents waiting to be signed. The will was brief, too brief. Colonel Knox had been meticulous his entire life, from folding his fatigues to aligning a sniper shot. But this, it read like a summary, a formality. Everything, real estate, accounts, stocks, heirlooms, transferred directly to Amelia Knox. No contingencies, no second name. I waited for a catch, a clause, a footnote. There was none. Instead, the attorney slid a plain white envelope across the table toward me. My name was scrawled in my father's blocky handwriting. I opened it slowly. Inside was a small velvet pouch containing a single item, his Korean War Challenge coin. Tucked behind it, a yellowed photo of him beside an F-86 Sabre, smiling. No words, no message, just a sticky note with 9 words. "Your father admired your discipline. He wanted you to have this." That was it. I stared at the coin, the metal warm from my fingers. He'd carried it every day. I remembered it on his nightstand, next to his watch. But now everything else, the house, the legacy, the voice in the family's future, belonged to Amelia. I didn't speak. I didn't cry. I just sat there as the attorney continued outlining terms to Amelia, using words like exclusive control and executive authority. She nodded with tight lips, the CEO of our bloodline. Then it came, like a dagger tossed casually across the table. "The Colonel added a mental health clause," the attorney said, not looking at me. "Any beneficiary flagged for unresolved psychological instability would be excluded." I felt my stomach drop. Amelia turned slightly, feigning surprise. "Oh, I suppose that would include Riley's evaluation from the Pentagon, wouldn't it?" she asked, voice soaked in fake curiosity. I blinked. "What evaluation?" "The one after Mosul," she said. "The mandatory counselling, 3 months of leave. You remember?" Of course I remembered. It had nearly broken me. But I'd completed the review, been cleared, returned to duty. I'd never told anyone about it, especially not her. "You accessed my military file?" I asked, my voice low. "I consulted the estate lawyer," she replied smoothly. "Just to ensure the will would be secure. You understand. Legal precaution." Legal precaution. She dug through my past, found my weakest moment, and used it to erase me from my own father's legacy. I clenched the coin in my fist, its ridges biting into my skin. The attorney stood and began packing up documents. Amelia was already checking her phone. To them, I was no longer a daughter, no longer family, just a footnote with a medal. I left the conference room without a word. My boots tapped against the hallway tile like a metronome, slow and steady, masking the static storm in my head. My father had cut me out of the will, or at least he'd allowed it to happen, and Amelia, my own sister, had engineered the blow like it was a strategic manoeuvre in a boardroom battle. She didn't even blink. I reached the parking garage and stood by my rental car for a moment, the heat from the concrete floor rising like vapour. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I couldn't. That would have given her what she wanted, proof I was fragile, unstable, everything she'd accused me of. But inside something cracked, not loudly, not like a broken bone. It was more subtle. Like the thread of trust between me and my father had finally snapped. And I wasn't sure it could be rewoven. Sliding into the driver's seat, I pulled the envelope from my jacket. The coin rested in my palm, heavy for its size, etched with age. I ran my thumb along its edges, remembering the sound it made whenever Dad flipped it between his fingers. I flipped it over, and that's when I saw it. Barely visible along the rim, tucked just beneath the engraved eagle wings, was a tiny series of numbers. DK9134CM. It wasn't part of the coin's original design. I would have remembered it. Hell, I used to stare at this thing for hours as a kid, turning it over in my hands like it was a magical token. This was new, or hidden. DK, I whispered. Douglas Knox, my father's initials, but the rest. 9134 could have been a code, a date, or even an ID number. CM, chain of memories, classified memo. It could have meant anything or everything. For a second, the fog in my chest lifted. Could it be a message? A breadcrumb? My father had always communicated better through systems than through words. When he didn't want to speak, he left notes. When he couldn't say, "I love you," he programmed it into our bedtime routines, chore lists, or chess lessons. I reached for my phone and typed the code into a secure search I used on base. No hits. I tried splitting it up. Still nothing. I sat there, coin in hand, heart pounding, not with grief, but with the quiet ache of hope. Had he known? Had he suspected what Amelia would do? The attorney's explanation had been too clean, too convenient. My father didn't do clean. He did structure, he did intent. And I felt that if he really wanted to exclude me, he wouldn't have bothered with the coin. He wouldn't have handed me this breadcrumb. He would have signed a form and left it at that. Instead, he gave me the one object he never let anyone else touch, and he'd marked it. Suddenly, I didn't feel like I'd been left with nothing. I felt like I'd been given a puzzle, a clue. And if there was one thing the Air Force had taught me, it was how to follow signs that others ignored. I slipped the coin into my breast pocket, resting it over my heart. Its weight no longer felt like rejection. It felt like fuel. Amelia might have won the inheritance, but maybe, just maybe, Dad had left me the truth. And truth, when used correctly, was far more explosive than any will. The Lisbon airport lounge buzzed with low conversation and the faint clatter of silverware. I sat near the window, nursing a lukewarm tea, trying not to stare at Amelia as she chatted with a flight attendant like they were old friends. Her designer suitcase stood perfectly upright beside her, unscuffed and polished like her entire existence. "We board in 20, she called out, not bothering to move closer. "Skybridge 37-2, business class, of course. I booked it. We'll sit together." The words hit like a slap. Not because of the seat assignment, but because she said, "of course," like it was a favour. Like I should be grateful she hadn't left me in coach with the tourists and crying babies. I rose slowly, adjusted my jacket, and joined her at the gate. You didn't have to book mine, I said, careful to keep my tone neutral. It would have looked strange, she replied, still scrolling on her phone. Imagine the optics. One sister in row 3, the other back near the toilets. Right, I said, lips tight. We boarded without speaking. I took the aisle seat. She claimed the window. Between us, a narrow armrest and miles of silence. Once airborne, Amelia ordered a Chardonnay before the flight attendant even finished the drink menu. She swirled the glass, then turned to me with that familiar gleam in her eye, the one that always meant trouble. "You're not in uniform?" she asked. I glanced down. I wore my base-issued black slacks and a navy shirt. Neat, plain, professional. No ribbons, no stripes, no indication of rank. I don't wear full dress for transatlantic flights. "Pity," she said, sipping. "I thought that's your thing. Salutes, discipline, boots." I didn't respond. She leaned in slightly. "You know, Dad really did think you'd grow out of the military phase. He told me once he hoped you'd get tired of running away from real life." That one stung, more than I wanted to admit. Amelia had a way of coating poison in Polish. Her words always sounded like concern, but they cut deeper than most insults. She never yelled. She never cursed. She just whispered carefully crafted sentences designed to unravel your confidence thread by thread. "I didn't join to run," I said quietly. "I joined to serve." She laughed, and that's adorable. I turned toward the aisle, blinking slowly. For years I'd wondered why Amelia hated my career. I used to think it was because she didn't understand it, couldn't relate to the structure, the sacrifice. But sitting beside her now with her wine and her smug tone, I realized something different. She resented it. Because while she was climbing corporate ladders, I was dodging mortars. While she polished resumes, I trained soldiers. And while she calculated inheritance percentages, I was flying evac missions in foreign skies. "You always had a flair for the dramatic," she continued, sipping again. "Even as a kid. Remember when you pretended to be a fighter pilot in the backyard? Who knew you'd turn it into a career?" I gave her a small smile. "Funny, I don't remember pretending." Her eyes narrowed slightly. The flight smoothed into cruising altitude. Overhead lights dimmed, trays clinked as meals were served. I kept my hands folded in my lap, the coin tucked safely in my pocket like a secret no one could steal. Amelia reclined her seat with a sigh. "You know what I think?" she murmured, voice low. "I think you wear the uniform because it's the only thing that gives you identity. Strip it away and you're just ordinary." I didn't answer. Not because she was right, but because she wasn't worth the words. Dinner trays were cleared and the cabin dimmed to that half-lit hush that makes it feel like midnight even when it isn't. Amelia leaned back in her seat, scrolling through her iPad with sharp practice swipes. Her glass of wine remained perfectly full, untouched since her last cutting remark. I stared at the seat back in front of me, forcing my breathing to stay even. The coin in my pocket pressed against my leg like a silent pulse, grounding me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Amelia turned her screen just slightly, enough for me to catch a glimpse. A document opened in full view, letterhead from the Valence Group, our father's holding company. Underneath the logo, final integration plan, board restructure approval, Amelia Knox. She didn't realize I could see it. Or maybe she did and didn't care. My heart rate ticked upward, but my face didn't move. She tapped open an attachment. This one was a spreadsheet. I recognised the format. It was a director-level clearance document, colour-coded lines, expense projections, stakeholder restructuring plans. But the worst part? There was a column labelled Risk Assessments, External Opposition. Next to my name, unfit, documented instability, no fiduciary capability. My mouth went dry. I wasn't just removed from the will, I was erased from the company, and she'd done it systematically. She turned another page, this time a memo with digital signatures. It was addressed to the board, and it claimed I had refused to provide updated financial disclosures for the last 5 years, citing military confidentiality. A lie, a bold one. I'd submitted those forms every quarter, even from deployment zones. I had the receipts, but here, in this new reality Amelia constructed, I was an unreliable liability. Not just to Dad's estate, but to the entire corporate legacy. She wasn't just inheriting, she was seizing power. And she'd been preparing for it for years. I swallowed the anger hard. No outbursts. Not here. Not on a plane at 36,000 feet with 300 passengers and nowhere to scream. Instead, I turned my head slowly toward her. "How long?" I asked, voice low. Amelia didn't flinch. She didn't even pretend to misunderstand. "Long enough," she said, still not looking up from the screen. Dad was tired. He wanted things to be simple. "Simple?" I echoed. "You're gone more than you're here. You don't attend meetings. You don't vote. You're detached." Her voice was calm, clinical. "And frankly, I've done the work. I deserve it. You forged my risk assessment." "I clarified it," she said coolly. "People deserve to know who they're dealing with." "You lied to the board." "I protected the company," she said, "from bad decisions, from sentimentality, from weakness." My jaw tightened, but I held her gaze. "You think you're strong because you manipulate paper trails," I said. "I've flown blackouts under fire with engines shot out. You think that makes me weak?" "No," she said. "I think it makes you dangerous. You don't belong in boardrooms, Riley. You belong in war zones, places where chaos makes sense to you." I turned away, the fury in my chest burning slow and deep. She had taken everything, my inheritance, my standing, my name. And now she was justifying it like she was doing me a favour. But I wasn't broken. Not yet. And if she thought this was over, if she thought a forged document and a legal technicality could bury me, then she'd forgotten the most important thing about soldiers. We don't surrender. We recalibrate. The hum of the engines was the kind of white noise most passengers tuned out within minutes of takeoff. But I didn't. I never could. Years of flight operations had trained me to listen to that hum, not as background, but as signal. That's why, 2 hours into the flight, I noticed the change. It was subtle at first, a slight shift in pitch, like the left engine was straining against uneven pressure. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but I felt it deep in my ribs. A faint vibration that wasn't there before. Then came the first jolt. Not violent, not yet, just enough to make the drink in my cup tremble. A flight attendant steadied herself near the galley and smiled a little too brightly. Amelia didn't even glance up. She was busy typing something on her iPad, lips pursed in concentration. Another vibration, this time sharper, like the aircraft had hit a pothole in the sky. I pressed my hand lightly against the armrest, feeling for resonance. Not turbulence, not really. Something was off balance. The seatbelt light pinged on. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting a brief period of turbulence." The captain's voice came through the speaker, smooth but rehearsed. "Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Brief, sure. I leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing as I glanced toward the wing. The clouds outside had thickened, but there was no storm cell visible on radar when we took off. No jet stream this rough. I'd reviewed the flight path out of habit before boarding. Nothing suggested weather like this. Another tremor rattled the overhead bins. This time someone gasped. Still no panic, yet. The smell came next, faint, acrid, like overheated plastic and ozone. Most would chalk it up to recycled cabin air or a faulty coffee machine. But I knew that scent. It was the smell of stressed wiring, burned insulation, systems under pressure. I glanced at Amelia. She was still absorbed in her world, brow furrowed in quiet focus. The irony stung. So wrapped in spreadsheets and false power, while the real world tilted beneath her. I unclipped my belt and stood, just long enough to adjust my jacket and discreetly scan the aisle. One flight attendant noticed me and gave a tight smile. "We're just hitting a little chop, ma'am," she said, voice too cheerful. "I know," I said. "I used to fly C-130s through Kandahar crosswinds. This isn't chop." She blinked. "Ma'am?" "Something's wrong with the aircraft," I said low enough for only her to hear. "You've got a systems issue? You can't smell that?" She hesitated, then sniffed the air. Her eyes widened just a fraction. "I'll check with the crew," she said quickly and moved toward the cockpit. I sat back down, locking my belt tight this time. Amelia gave me a sidelong glance. "What now? Practicing turbulence drills?" I didn't answer, because I was too busy running mental checklists, ones I hadn't used in years, electrical fire protocol, engine stall contingencies, pressure loss sequences. They came back to me like old friends in a dark alley, uninvited but necessary. A sharp clang echoed from somewhere near the rear galley. Passengers murmured. Overhead lights flickered once, then steadied. The hum of the engines dipped just slightly before recalibrating. That wasn't routine. That was mechanical hesitation. My stomach tightened. I'd felt this once before, on a night mission over hostile airspace when a hydraulic pump blew mid-turn. The feeling of being trapped in a machine that wanted to fall. I reached into my pocket and touched the coin, not for luck, for clarity. Because if this went where I thought it might, I needed to be ready, not as a passenger, but as the only person on this plane who understood what might come next. I turned to Amelia. "Put your iPad away." She raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "Put it away and buckle your belt. Tight. Is this one of your little drills?" "No. This is me telling you to stop pretending you know everything and listen." Something in my tone must have reached her. She paused. Then, slowly, closed the tablet and clicked her belt into place. Another jolt rocked the fuselage, harder this time. A cart in the aisle rolled several inches before a crew member grabbed it. A baby began to cry, somewhere near the back, and I knew. We weren't just bouncing through rough skies. We were descending into something worse. The tension in the cabin grew thick, palpable. People whispered across aisles. The hum of the engines dipped again, this time more dramatically. I felt the air pressure shift slightly, almost imperceptibly, like the aircraft had inhaled and then forgotten how to exhale. Amelia glanced around nervously, her facade cracking just enough to reveal a thin sliver of concern. "This is why I don't fly budget," she muttered, then looked at me. Probably some underpaid ex-military pilot who thinks flying a passenger jet is just another combat sim. I turned slowly toward her. "You think combat training is a game?" She shrugged. "All I'm saying is, pushing buttons in a cockpit doesn't make you a leader. It makes you a technician. You don't belong in boardrooms or battlefields. You belong in a simulator." Before I could respond, the entire aircraft lurched sideways. A collective gasp filled the cabin. Overhead bins popped. A bag dropped near row 12. Someone screamed. The intercom crackled, then silence. No pilot voice, no update, just silence. I looked forward, nothing but a closed cockpit door. The plane dipped again, sharper this time. The left wing dropped, then recovered with a mechanical groan, not turbulence, control loss. Then the oxygen masks deployed. Panic bloomed instantly. Screams, yells, a child's voice calling for their mother. Passengers clawed at the masks, pulling them down with trembling hands. Amelia froze, her wine glass toppling onto her lap. What's happening? I was already moving. I reached up, yanked down my own mask and secured it. Then I stood, locking eyes with the nearest flight attendant who looked seconds away from a breakdown. The cockpit, I said. Is the crew responsive? She shook her head, wide-eyed. They're not answering. The captain, he's not moving. The co-pilot's trying to... I don't know what's happening. I pushed past her. The aisle was chaos. People unbuckled, rebuckled, crying, some frozen in fear. I stepped over a fallen food tray, gripping seatbacks for balance as the plane shuddered again. Then I reached the cockpit door, locked. I knocked hard, no answer. Behind me, Amelia stumbled forward, breath shallow, eyes wide with disbelief. You can't just barge in there, she said. I turned to her. Amelia, shut up. She opened her mouth to argue, but then another violent dip. The plane yawed sharply left. Plates smashed in the galley, the lights flickered, and finally, through the small viewing pane, I saw the captain, slumped, motionless. I banged again, this time harder. Open the door, I shouted to the co-pilot, hoping he could hear me through the reinforced panel. Another flicker, then click. The door cracked open. A pale, sweating face appeared, mid-30s, panicked, the co-pilot. She's unresponsive, he gasped. Systems are failing. There's a fire code on 2 panels. I can't... Move, I said. He hesitated, then stepped aside, and just like that I crossed the line between passenger and pilot. The cockpit was a furnace of noise and warning lights. Red and amber flashed across every panel like a storm of urgent signals screaming for attention. The air smelled of heat and ozone, and I could feel the sharp tang of burnt plastic scraping the back of my throat. Somewhere beneath the chaos, the alarm for Engine 2 failure whined like a wounded animal. The captain was slumped sideways in his chair, oxygen mask hanging uselessly by his neck. His chest rose and fell, shallow but alive. His right hand still clutched the yoke loosely, like he'd tried to stay in control even as consciousness faded. The co-pilot, narrow shoulders, short brown hair, was trembling, both hands dancing between switches as if trying to swat the problem away. I don't know what else to do, he said, without turning to look at me. We lost pressure in 2. Hydraulics are inconsistent. I'm trying to isolate, but she's not responding like she should. I moved quickly, bypassing emotion and slipping into training. Muscle memory took over. Status on Engine 1? I asked. Holding, for now, but she's overcompensating. Heat's climbing. I leaned across the captain, checking the centre console. Panel 2 was flickering, and the trim system was cycling too fast. The smell of burned insulation meant something had overloaded, likely electrical. The redundancy systems were engaged, but not stable. "What's your name?" I asked, scanning the instruments. "Stokes. First Officer David Stokes." "Okay, Stokes, I'm Riley Knox, US Air Force, multi-engine certified. I need to take over." He blinked at me, confused. "Wait, you're a passenger." I was. "Now I'm your best shot at getting this bird down in one piece." Another vibration hit the fuselage, this time stronger. The autopilot chirped, disengaged, then tried to re-engage. I reached forward and flicked it off entirely. Stokes hesitated. His hands hovered. "You good?" I asked. He stared at me for a beat too long, then stepped back. "I'm good," he said. "You've got it." I slipped into the captain's seat, adjusting the harness quickly. The yoke was sluggish, resistant. It reminded me of the old Hercules models when you flew them dry and low over desert heat. Hydraulics were damaged. Thrust balance was skewed. One engine working, the other dead weight. Instruments glitching, but she was still flying. Barely. I grabbed the radio. "Skybridge 37-2, I said. Captain incapacitated, co-pilot in distress. Aircraft assumed by alternate qualified pilot. Request immediate vector to nearest emergency strip." Static buzzed for 2 long seconds. Then, "Confirmed Skybridge 3072, Madrid Centre here. Diverting to Ros's airfield. Southwest 150 miles. Runway length marginal for your aircraft. Do you copy?" "Copy," I replied. "We'll make it work." Stokes stared at me like I was either insane or heroic, maybe both. Behind me, the cockpit door remained open, revealing part of the cabin in disarray, passengers wide-eyed, gripping their armrests. Amelia stood just past the threshold, as if watching a movie she couldn't pause. Her mouth opened, but no words came. I ignored her. The checklist printed automatically, curling out from the tiny slot in the panel. I grabbed it, scanning the emergency protocol. Engine fire suppression had triggered automatically, but one of the pumps wasn't responding. We'd be bleeding pressure for the remainder of the flight. "I need full manual control," I told Stokes. He nodded. "Already rerouted hydraulic backup." "Good. Monitor engine 1. Watch for heat spikes." I reached down, reset the trim, and adjusted the fuel flow to level out our climb rate. The aircraft slowly responded, less jittery but still wounded. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said over the cabin intercom, "this is Riley Knox. I've assumed partial control of the flight. We are diverting and stabilizing. Please remain seated and calm." Silence met my announcement, then a ripple of sound, shocked whispers, quiet prayers, the sound of people deciding whether to panic or believe. I didn't have time to convince them. We were still 32,000 feet in the air. And every mile between us and the runway was a negotiation with a plane that no longer wanted to fly. "You can't be serious." The voice cut through the tense quiet like a jagged blade. I didn't have to turn to know it was Amelia. Her heels clacked sharply against the cockpit floor as she stepped fully inside, mouth already open for another outburst. "Who gave you permission to touch that yoke?" she demanded. "You're not airline certified. You can't just assume control of a commercial jet." I didn't look at her. My hands stayed steady on the controls, eyes scanning the altimeter, fuel gauges, trim indicators. Engine 1 was holding, but barely. "Stokes," she snapped, turning to the co-pilot. "You let her take over? She's not in her right mind. She has a history." Stokes hesitated. "She's stabilizing the aircraft." "She's not even legally allowed in that seat," Amelia hissed. "She has PTSD. She's on record for psychological evaluation. I'll have both of you arrested for endangering civilian lives." That did it. I turned, slowly, one hand still on the yoke. My voice was calm, too calm. "Amelia," I said, "get out." She blinked, caught off guard by the iciness. "You don't get to throw around paperwork and buzzwords in a burning cockpit. You don't get to weaponize my worst days while sitting pretty in first class, sipping Chardonnay and Googling power grabs. This isn't a boardroom, this is a crisis, and the only person in this cockpit who's flown a bird with one engine over hostile terrain is me." She opened her mouth. I raised a finger. "No, not this time. Not with lives on the line. You don't speak, you don't challenge, you don't even breathe too loudly unless you're doing it back in seat 14A. The silence was instant. Amelia's jaw locked. Her face, usually composed to a fault, twitched at the edges. She was used to rooms bending to her words, to people folding under the weight of her cold authority. But here? Here she was just another passenger, one without a clue how close we'd come to dying. Behind her, the flight attendant stood frozen, eyes wide with the unmistakable look of someone watching a power dynamic shift in real time. "You don't understand what you're doing," Amelia said again, weaker now. "You're going to kill us." "No," I said, my tone razor thin. "I'm going to save us." Stokes glanced at me, then at her. "She's already saving us." That knocked the last breath from Amelia's bravado. She stared at him, then at the lights blinking wildly around the cockpit, the silent alarms, the faint smell of melted insulation. Finally she backed away. "I'll be speaking to a lawyer the moment we land," she muttered. "If we land," I said, not looking at her. That stopped her in her tracks. She didn't move. She didn't speak. For the first time in her life, Amelia Knox had no rebuttal, no counter, no leverage, only helplessness. She turned and walked out. The flight attendant backed away as Amelia passed, then gently closed the cockpit door behind her. The click echoed louder than any shout. I exhaled slowly and turned back to the controls. Stokes leaned in slightly. "You always that composed under fire?" I shrugged. "Only when I have to deal with family." The panel flickered again. A warning buzzed. Hydraulic pressure dropping further. No time for reflection. "Let's focus," I said. "What's our distance to Roz's airfield?" 78 miles and closing, Stokes replied. "Begin descent prep. We're flying heavy." He nodded and we got to work. Behind us, 300 people sat in varying degrees of fear. But they didn't know what had just happened behind the curtain. They didn't see the real war, the one that had nothing to do with engines and everything to do with control. And for once, I hadn't needed a gun, a rank, or a court order to win, just truth, delivered without apology. Roz's airfield appeared on radar like a faint blip, too small, too remote, and too forgotten. It was a decommissioned military strip, nestled between a ridge of rocky hills and thick pine forests. 6,000 feet of cracked concrete and faded runway lights. Not nearly long enough for a fully loaded commercial jet, but it was all we had. "Confirmed field clearance," came the voice-over comms. "Emergency crews en route. Caution advised. Runway integrity not guaranteed." Not guaranteed. I'd landed on worse. "It's copy," I replied. "Skybridge 37-2, commencing glide approach. Captain incapacitated. Engine 2 failed. Engine 1 unstable." Beside me, Stokes adjusted the map overlay. "We're still carrying too much weight. Landing this heavy is going to break us on impact." "Not if we glided in," I said. He blinked. "You want to cut the last engine?" "Not yet, but soon." He looked like he wanted to protest, but then stopped. He saw it in my face. This wasn't an idea. It was a decision. Commercial aircraft don't glide like fighters. They're not built for finesse. They descend like freight. Controlled, yes, but lumbering and unwilling. A full cut of power meant no thrust to stabilize yaw, no assistance with pitch trim. It meant relying entirely on lift, angle, and wind. A maneuver not trained in airline simulators, but I wasn't trained in simulators. I was trained in war. "Start dumping fuel from the right tank," I instructed. "Crossfeed open. We need to lighten every ounce." Stokes nodded, hands moving quickly. The cockpit creaked around us, a wounded ship groaning under strain. Outside the windshield, the coastline shimmered under late sun, distant and surreal. "Altitude?" I asked. 23,000 and falling. Speed holding at 260 knots. We needed to bleed both. slow and sink without losing too much lift. I took a breath, then reached toward the throttle. "You sure about this?" Stokes asked. "No," I said. "But we don't have another option." And I pushed it. Engine 1 dropped to idle. The vibration changed instantly, less roar, more whisper. The aircraft's bulk resisted the silence like it didn't understand. The nose dipped gently, and I eased back on the yoke to balance the descent. We were flying without thrust, riding a glider the size of a small building. Stokes stared at the instruments. Pitch controls soft. Hydraulics are down to 70%. Trims manual. Keep adjusting every 500 feet. Acknowledged? The radio crackled again. Skybridge 3072, be advised. Winds from north-northwest at 12 knots. Final vector confirmed. I repeated the coordinates and banked us gently left. From the cabin came nothing but the ambient hush of strained silence. No more shouts. No panic. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that settles when people realise their fate is no longer in their own hands. The kind of quiet I'd known in cockpits, in sandstorms, in the dead air between gunfire and breath. I glanced down at the coin in my breast pocket, not for luck, but for focus. This was the edge. And I'd flown on it before. The descent stabilised around 18,000 feet, and the aircraft eased into its glide path with unnerving grace. Stokes was focused on recalculating drag ratios, but I noticed something strange flashing on the secondary systems panel. A file was open, something that hadn't been there before. A line of coded text pulsed on the screen like a heartbeat. "What's that?" I asked, pointing. Stokes followed my finger. "Maintenance log backup, I think. System pulled it up automatically when the redundancy tree triggered." "Pull it forward." He tapped a few keys. The screen flickered, then expanded. It was a digital maintenance entry, dated 48 hours prior to our departure. Tagged routine systems check, engine hydraulics calibration. But next to the file name was a small red triangle, a warning icon. I narrowed my eyes. "Decrypt that, now." "It's not in airline format," Stokes said, frowning. "This looks military or corporate proprietary?" A cold knot formed in my gut. He keyed in a universal override. The system hesitated. Then a string of logs popped up. Dozens of entries, most marked standard. One marked override applied. I leaned closer. The override entry wasn't signed by Skybridge's maintenance team. The digital signature belonged to ClearPath Aviation Services. The name hit me like a punch. ClearPath had just been acquired by Amelia's firm 2 months ago. She bragged about it at Dad's memorial brunch. "We're optimising fleet support across Europe," she'd said, all smiles and champagne, "saving the company millions." I stared at the screen. "Look at the checklist ID," I said. Stokes zoomed in. CP8YD94, the same ID tied to our Engine 2 diagnostics. Below that, in a note attached to the override, non-critical bypass authorised. Pressure regulators substituted for approved equivalents. "Jesus," I whispered. "They swapped components to cut cost." "Unapproved parts?" Stokes asked, stunned. "Not technically unapproved," I muttered. "But they're not certified for this model. They saved a few $1,000 and left us with a time bomb." And Amelia signed the final clearance. The digital stamp was there. AM Knox CPA, time-stamped 24 hours before takeoff. Stokes exhaled sharply. "You think she knew?" "She knew it was risky, maybe not this risky, but she knew." The rage that flared in my chest wasn't hot, it was cold, focused. It didn't scream, it calcified. Amelia hadn't just tried to erase me from Dad's legacy. She'd nearly killed 300 people to squeeze a little more profit from her newest acquisition. And now I had the proof. I sat back in the seat, staring at the silent readout. I could have missed it. A dozen other pilots might have missed it. Maybe the old captain did, and it cost him consciousness. But I didn't. I saw it, and I wasn't going to let it disappear again. "Can you download the file?" I asked. Stokes nodded, already pushing it to the black box and cockpit backup. "It'll be in the post-flight report." Good. Because I wasn't just going to land this plane, I was going to land it with a story that couldn't be buried. The story of how greed almost killed a plane full of innocents. And how the soldier they left behind became the one they had to answer to. Outside, the ground was rising slowly. We were just above 10,000 feet now. The final descent would come fast, brutal, and without backup. But I wasn't scared. I was ready. Because this wasn't just a landing anymore. It was a reckoning. The runway emerged through the grey veil of low-hanging clouds like a lifeline drawn in faded chalk. Narrow, cracked, and barely long enough to matter. Wind whipped across the nose of the aircraft, nudging us left and right like a predator testing a wounded animal. "Altitude 4,200 feet, Stokes reported, his voice tight. "Speed holding at 185 knots. We're heavy on descent." "Gear down," I said. He flipped the switch. The aircraft groaned as the landing gear engaged, a delayed thunk echoing through the fuselage. For a horrifying second, the starboard indicator flickered red, then locked to green. "Gear confirmed," he said. "Flaps to full," I ordered. "Let her drag." Stokes adjusted the flaps. The plane resisted, then dipped forward, levelling at the right slope. The stall warning blinked, once, then again, but I knew the margin. We were skimming the edge, not falling over it. In the cabin behind us, the intercom rang out. "This is the flight deck. Brace for landing. Head down, feet flat, belts tight." The ripple of movement was instant. Some passengers whispered prayers, others sobbed quietly. A man in the back began reciting names, maybe family, maybe regrets. And somewhere near row 14, I imagined Amelia clutching her handbag, realising there was no PR firm in the world that could spin this moment. My hands were steady on the yoke, my breath slow. Focus narrowed to one task: get everyone on the ground alive. "Wind out of the west," Stokes warned. "Slight cross. You'll have to kick the nose straight just before flare." "Copy that." Roz's runway came up fast. Trees lined both sides like silent judges, waiting to see if we made it or crashed trying. "Final approach, 300 feet. I eased the nose up slightly. Too much flare would bounce us. Too little would rip the front gear off. My fingers felt every tremble in the yoke, every resistance in the stick, like I was guiding a dying beast to its last landing. 200 feet. Ground proximity alarms chirped, but I ignored them. "Speed at 142, Stokes said. "Perfect." "Keep an eye on brake assist," I said. "If we don't hit reverse in the first 3 seconds, we overshoot." He nodded. 100 feet. The earth rushed toward us. The wind screamed across the fuselage. 50! The rear gear touched first, hard. A violent lurch rocked the cabin. Then the nose slammed down, skidding slightly left. "Reverse thrust," I barked. Stokes yanked the toggles. The remaining engine howled as reverse engaged, dragging the aircraft backward against momentum. "Brake assist on!" We screamed down the strip, tyres screeching, emergency lights flashing past on the edge of the tarmac. The old runway buckled beneath us, the jet bouncing like a stone skipping water. "Still fast," Stokes shouted. 60 knots. "Hold it centre." I gritted my teeth and corrected the yaw with a hard push on the rudder. The left tyre dipped off slightly, then climbed back. 40 knots. The trees loomed ahead. Closer, closer, 30. The brakes bit hard. Everyone inside was pushed forward. Overhead bins snapped open, bags spilling. 20. The end of the runway was a blur now. Gravel, brush and trees beyond. 10. We stopped, dead still. For a moment silence reigned. No alarms, no screaming engines, just the hiss of the vents and the quiet collective breath of 300 souls who hadn't dared believe they'd still be alive. Stokes let out a sound, between a laugh and a sob. "We did it," he said. I didn't reply. I was staring straight ahead, hands still on the yoke. Then slowly I leaned back and whispered, "Yeah, we did." The cockpit door opened behind us. A flight attendant peeked in, face pale and tear-streaked. Is it over?" "Yes," I said. "Landing's done. Rescue's yours." She nodded, already calling out to her crew. Outside, through the windshield, emergency vehicles raced toward us. Fire trucks, ambulances, blinking lights in all directions. But we weren't on fire, we weren't smoke and wreckage. We were upright, intact, alive. By the time the last passenger stepped off the plane, the tarmac was a mosaic of blinking lights, emergency responders, and camera flashes. Somewhere between the landing gear and the ambulance, I became a headline. A reporter shouted through a megaphone, "Ma'am, is it true you landed the plane?" Another aimed a mic toward me, her voice shrill with awe. "What's your name? Are you a pilot?" I gave neither of them an answer. My boots touched ground, and I walked straight into the chill of the evening air, blanket draped over my shoulders by a trembling EMT. He muttered something like, "Hero," but I was already too far inside my head to respond. People were alive. That should have been enough. But I knew it wasn't over. It never is. 3 hours later, in a temporary holding room at the Airfield's Operations Centre, I sat under fluorescent lighting with my ID badge laid on the metal table in front of me. Stokes sat nearby, sipping water, still shaking from the come-down of adrenaline. The door creaked open. A liaison officer stepped inside, followed by a man in a civilian suit. He didn't introduce himself. He simply said, "There's been a formal inquiry filed." I looked up. "On what grounds?" He didn't blink. "Unauthorized assumption of flight controls, breach of protocol, potential violation of international aviation law." I leaned forward. "You're investigating me for saving a plane." "The report was submitted anonymously," he said. "Of course it was." Stokes sat up. "You can't be serious. She landed a crippled 777 on a glorified driveway." The liaison officer cut in. "And we're grateful, but the FAA, the NTSB, and Air Mobility Command have all been alerted. We're obligated to investigate." "Even if the pilot was unconscious, even if no one else could fly?" I asked. "There's also a concern regarding your service record," the man in the suit added. "Specifically, the psychological eval post-Mosul. It was flagged in the report." There it was, the knife. Same one Amelia had used at the will reading. I leaned back slowly. "Did the anonymous report also include a full maintenance log of the aircraft?" The man blinked. "Excuse me?" "The override authorization signed by Amelia Knox? The substitution of critical components? The intentional bypass of safety certifications?" The room fell silent. "I assume that'll be in the investigation too," I said. They didn't answer. They didn't need to. I already knew. This wasn't just a protocol review. It was a hit job. And there was only one person with the means, motive, and history of using official systems as a weapon. Amelia. She'd barely spoken after the landing, just made a few calls, disappeared into the blur of media and military. But she was moving in the background, like she always did, making calls, pushing paper, rewriting narratives while the rest of us tried to breathe. I clenched my jaw. She wasn't done. She'd lost the moment, the glory, the crowd, but she was still playing the long game, destroying me from behind closed doors. And now she had a new tool, my heroism. Twist it hard enough, and it could look like recklessness. push the right narrative, and I'd become a liability. A soldier with delusions of grandeur, a trigger-happy vet who took command of a commercial jet without consent. But I wasn't going to play defence, not anymore. They called me the soldier who saved the sky. It was plastered across headlines, blogs, late-night talk shows. Clips from the emergency landing were played on loop. News anchors marvelling at the miracle descent. Commentators debating whether I should be promoted or handed a medal. On the outside, I was a national hero. Inside, I was under investigation, not for what I failed to do, but for everything I did right. I sat in a grey conference room on a US Air Force base in Gander, Canada, flanked by 2 attorneys and a blinking digital recorder. A JAG officer from the Department of Defense asked questions with the subtlety of a courtroom sniper. Captain Knox, did you have explicit authorization from the airline to assume control of the aircraft? No, I said. Did you have written clearance from the flight crew or chain of command? There was no command. The pilot was unconscious. The co-pilot was overwhelmed. The plane was descending with 300 lives on board. He didn't flinch. That's not the question. Across the room, another man from the FAA added, "We're reviewing whether your assumption of control, regardless of intent, violated civilian airspace command protocols." Intent. They kept circling that word like it was the enemy. As if my intention to save lives needed a waiver form. One of my lawyers cleared her throat. Let the record reflect that Captain Knox acted in accordance with her flight training under emergency conditions after both certified pilots were incapacitated. And yet, the JAG officer said, folding his hands, there remains a concern about her judgment, given her prior psychological flag. There it was again, Mosul, the evaluation, the forced 3-month leave. The scar I thought had faded, brought back to the surface like a wound I didn't earn. This is a technical review, they kept saying, not personal. But it was personal, because outside that room, my face was everywhere. Riley Knox, fighter pilot, decorated captain, PTSD survivor, and now potential liability. Meanwhile, Amelia was already reshaping the story. She'd done interviews, polished, tearful segments on morning shows where she talked about the terror of not knowing and how it was horrifying to be in a plane, knowing your sister might be having a breakdown while flying. She called herself a survivor. Said she'd filed a report out of fear, not malice. She told the world she loved me and that she just wanted me to get help. I watched the footage once, alone in my quarters, jaw tight, hands shaking, not from emotion, but restraint. She was playing the victim so well, you'd think she'd crash-landed the plane herself. And the public? They were torn. Some still cheered. Others asked questions. She was a soldier, not a commercial pilot, one analyst said on a panel. Is she emotionally stable enough for this kind of pressure? Another asked. She broke protocol. She saved everyone. She shouldn't have been in the cockpit. They weren't arguing about me. They were arguing about the version of me they'd built, not the one who smelled the wiring burn before anyone else. Not the one who read a hidden maintenance log mid-descent. Not the one who found calm inside a dying machine. They weren't arguing about Riley Knox, the pilot. They were dissecting Riley Knox, the symbol, and symbols don't get a say. I sat on the edge of my cot that night, the coin in my hand, turning slowly between my fingers. The numbers etched in the metal caught the dim light. DK9134CM, Dad's final message. The reminder that something bigger was hidden beneath the surface. He'd known. Maybe not everything, but enough. He knew Amelia would bury me if she could. That's why he left me the coin, not the cash, not the house. The truth. And truth doesn't burn, it waits. But waiting is lonely. I hadn't heard from anyone in the family, not a call, not a message. Not even a text asking if I was okay, as if saving lives wasn't enough to be invited back in, as if I was still the daughter in boots they didn't want at the table. The toy soldier, as Amelia called me, maybe I was, but that toy held a plane together with grit and muscle memory. That toy landed 300 souls when everything else had failed. And now? Now I was being told to sit still while lawyers debated whether that courage was convenient. Weeks passed like a slow-moving storm. The investigation dragged on, filled with paperwork, interviews, and legal manoeuvres. But just when I thought the world would keep turning without ever truly seeing me, something shifted. A video surfaced online. It was grainy, shaky footage from mid-flight, shot, no doubt, by a passenger seated nearby. Amelia's voice, unmistakable and venomous, echoed through the cabin. "She's not even a real pilot," Amelia sneered, tone dripping with contempt. "Just a toy soldier playing dress-up?" The clip cut sharply to other moments, her dismissing crew concerns, laughing at Riley's uniform, mocking every bit of authority I carried. Then, almost like a thunderclap, another document leaked. The internal maintenance report, the one I'd discovered in the cockpit. The file signed off by Amelia's company showing the unauthorised parts and the bypassed safety checks. Two pieces of evidence that tore apart the carefully crafted narrative Amelia had spun. Suddenly, the public wasn't confused anymore. They knew the truth. Social media exploded. Justice for Riley trended globally. Comments poured in, thousands of messages from strangers thanking me, praising my courage and condemning the betrayal. The narrative flipped. I was no longer the troubled vet who seized control. I was the hero who saved hundreds. The military investigation quietly folded. No formal charges, no hearings, no medals, just silence. But sometimes silence speaks loudest. I returned to my unit with no fanfare, no marching band, just the sound of boots on concrete and the steady hum of airplanes overhead. No headlines, no praise, just duty. But inside, I carried something more powerful than recognition. I carried the knowledge that I had saved 300 lives, that I had exposed a system willing to sacrifice safety for profit, that I had made a difference. Amelia's shadow receded into obscurity, her ambitions unravelling under the weight of truth. But for me, the story wasn't about fame. It was about survival, about fighting when no one else would, about being the soldier left behind and refusing to stay there. And as I walked onto the flight line that morning, uniform crisp and coin in pocket, I wasn't just a pilot. I was a reminder that sometimes the quietest heroes make the loudest impact.